Now let's get right to it. It's time for your reality check. And it begins with this. President Trump threatened on Monday to strip the security clearance of top former officials who criticized his refusal to confront Russia over its election interference. The president's move signals a willingness to use the power of the presidency to retaliate against his most outspoken critics. During his time in office, President Trump has repeatedly attacked the U.S. intelligence community, portraying them as part of the so-called deep state, an unelected faction seeking to steer U.S. policy and undercut the president. Among those who could lose access are John Brennan, former CIA director, Susan Rice, former national security advisor, James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, just to name a few. Now let's talk about it. America, this tactic of going after your enemies so relentlessly is something that you would only see in a drama on television. But the Trump administration, America, is the greatest show on earth without a tent. So maybe we are seeing America's greatest drama on television. Here is the job of the president is to live above the fray. Sadly, our president seems to live in the fray. And these problems could have all been avoided if President Trump had just went to Helsinki and answered the questions and posed the questions and answered honestly and said, Putin, we know you engaged in our election and it must stop. But that's not our president, and this is not a game of truth or dare. This is reality. And our president instead found every other excuse instead of answering the question directly. Yes, the Russians engaged in our election, and yes, there will be consequences for Russia to pay. Instead, President Trump talked about the DNC server. He talked about an IT guy from India. He even managed to talk about the FBI deep state. So here are my questions for all those deep state believers. When did the deep state start? Exactly. Who is the leader of said deep state? What is the mission of the deep state? And when will the deep state end? These are all questions that I have all questions that I really want answers to. Because they keep going around talking about, oh, this is the deep state, the far left, the far left. But then you look at some of these people and you evaluate their resumes. People like John Brennan, people like James Comey, people like Robert Mueller, people like Rod Rosenstein, people like Peter Strzok, people like Peter McCabe. And you look and you say, are they really the deep state? Are they really these so-called liberal elites? Because I'm pretty sure their voting records, they probably voted more for Republicans than they did for Democrats. I'm pretty sure they applauded Trump's tax cuts because they benefited from it. And I'm pretty sure they all agreed with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. These folks are probably as conservative can get. They are to conservative what America is to what apple pie is to America. Synonymous. So to take away their clearance because you don't like what they think about you is pretty astonishing. It's almost downright plutocratic. Let's take a listen to what James Clapper had to say about this on CNN.
National intelligence. Mr. Clapper, you are apparently now on a list, according to the White House. Of 2 minutes ago, they would like to revoke your security clearance. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's kind of an interesting news. I'm reading it and learning about it just as you are. I think it's, off the top of my head, it's kind of a sad commentary where, for political reasons, this is kind of a petty way of retribution, I suppose, for speaking out against the president, which I think are on the part of all of us, are born out of genuine concerns about President Trump.
Now, the rationale the White House gives for taking away these clearances have been because these individuals are disrespecting the President of the United States and they're using these clearances to profit. Now, a couple things, because the facts actually do matter. Number one, none of these individuals still receive top secret briefings. Period. The clearance is merely as a courtesy, and the clearances are also utilized because when these former individuals have clearance, they allow new governments to call them back in to utilize them as a resource when an issue that they once worked on comes up. I'll give you an example. Let's say perhaps that you pick the issue. Let's say Egypt comes up again, and there's a situation that sort of happens in Egypt. It would behoove this White House to probably have a conversation with James Clapper. It might even behoove this White House to have a conversation with Susan Rice. It probably would behoove this White House to have a conversation with John Brennan. All individuals that were there with Barack Obama and the Obama administration during the time of the Muslim uprising. They could provide well-needed context. They could also provide some well-needed advice on what to do if a situation in Egypt erupts. And a lot of times, in order for them to have these conversations, they have to be brought into or read into what is currently happening, which could be at the level of top secret or even higher levels of clearances, which is why you maintain their clearance. Additionally, let me say this again, many individuals that have clearance make money, either as consultants or TV commentators or even authors. Don't take my word for it. Just go to your nearest defense consulting firm and have a look at the people on the website. 99% of them have some sort of clearance that was grandfathered over from their time when they served in the Defense Department or our intelligence infrastructure. So having a clearance has become a way of life in Washington for far too many. So if the president's going to go after these clearances, Mr. President, go after all the clearances, including the clearance of your former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, who is currently under investigation, who's currently already pled guilty to lying to the FBI and is part of the Robert Mueller investigation. You see, he, at a nationally televised convention, in front of the eyes of many, yelled to the world that they should lock up Hillary Clinton for no crime in particular. He just wanted to give red meat to the crowd. He used his clearance to engage in political activity. He also used his clearance to make money. But was his clearance revoked by the Obama administration? No. Why? Because he once served as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And there could have been a possibility that his advice could have been worthwhile in the future. These things go far beyond just what's happening in the Trump administration. And I think that's what's so important for the Americans at home to realize. Remember, America, we cannot see our democracy in 1 or 2 or 3 year frames. We must see our democracy in 10 and 15-year frames. So, the fact that President Trump has been so quick to dismantle many of the institutions that make our democracy great should alarm us all. Not because they're part of some sort of elusive deep state, but because these institutions are what are necessary to make our democracy great and make us the city upon a hill. His destruction, the president that is, his destruction of these institutions should stand as a warning that our democracy is a lot more fragile than you think it is. His willingness to go after his political enemies with the full force of the Oval Office should remind us how fast our democracy can slip into a plutocracy. They should remind us how important your vote is, and it should remind us how important checks and balances are and why our founders put them in our Constitution to begin with.